Hello, and thank you very much to Pete and the team at Imagine Belfast for allowing me to talk today about this piece of research that I've been engaged with. And it's partly research that I've been doing for a long time, and then observations on, the last number of years I think that we've all picked up on in relation to Brexit and the negotiations to leave the EU. So I've decided to call this presentation The Truth in the News, and basically it's called The Truth in the News because that was the motto of the Irish Press newspaper, which I'm going to be looking at in this particular talk. I've put a question mark of my own in after it because it deals with propaganda around what was known as the economic war in the 1930s. Between Britain and Ireland. And there are a couple of, very noticeable parallels to be drawn with what we've all been looking on with interest and with, I suppose we've all been exasperated by it at some point or another. So I'll be looking at some of the cartoons that were published in the 1930s in the Irish Press newspaper. It was to do with the economic war. I'd like to say I'm far from an economic historian or an expert on international trade. These are just observations that I've been noting down in relation to life in the 1930s. That's what I research and teach on, is the interwar period in Ireland and further afield. And one can't help but tap into what was known as the economic war. That was a trade dispute between Britain and Ireland in that period. But what I'm looking at today is the cartoons, as I say, and the first half of the 20th century, particularly the early decades, were pretty much a golden age for Irish editorial cartoons. You had a number of cartoonists playing their trade in various daily newspapers, magazines, the likes of Thomas Fitzpatrick, the Leprechaun magazine. He's the grandfather of the artist today, Jim Fitzpatrick. You had Ernest Forbes in the Freeman's Journal looking at cartoons around what was known as the Irish Revolutionary period. The 20s and 30s, you had Gordon Brewster in Dublin's Evening Herald. But my own personal favourite, and the one I've done the most research on, is Victor Brown. And Victor Brown was the editorial cartoonist for the Irish Press newspaper in the early years of the newspaper's existence. And a lot of Brown's cartoons deal with what were essentially Fianna Fáil's economic ambitions and their political agenda. So we're going to look at that. But to start off with, I'll just give a brief bit of background on what the economic war was. So in February 1932, Fianna Fáil win the general election and come to power in March of 1932. And one of their first acts as a new government is to suspend what is known as the land annuities. And this was a payment to Britain each year, obligations which had been agreed in the 1921 Anglo-Irish Agreement. So with De Valera coming into power, they suspend these, and they're to the tune of £5 million back in 1932. So that's roughly in the tens of millions, if not more, in today's money. So it's not an insignificant amount. With the coming of De Valera to power, the relationship with Britain changed considerably. And we see this cartoon here in front of us. It's a Punch magazine cartoon of De Valera, and which shows what are likely to be the nativist policies that Fianna Fáil were going to enact. This is from February of 1932, just after De Valera wins the election. So we see that they're aware that the relationship between Britain and Ireland, which was pretty stabilised in the 1920s under the Fine Gael government, is now likely to be changed significantly, and they were right about that. In relation to the economic war, as I've pointed out, it was the suspension of land annuities that caused the economic war. Britain sought to recoup some of these, the money that Ireland was withholding, by imposing a 20% duty on Irish exports into Britain. Ireland retaliated by imposing 20% on their own on the likes of coal, which was coming into Britain, and that led to the economic war. Now, The Irish economy suffered really badly because England was their prime market. And from 1932 to 1935, what you see is the prices of fat and store cattle dropped by almost a half, and it significantly damaged the agricultural economy. But however, the Irish Press newspaper, particularly through the cartoons of Victor Brown, it didn't, they didn't reflect this because they were essentially propaganda to show that they were winning the economic war. I would go on now just to explain the role of the Irish press in this period. Now, the Irish press was a newcomer on the scene. It was first published in September of 1931, and from the outset, it was keen to stress its Irish Republican and separatist credentials. It was established by De Valera through money fundraising from the United States over a number of years, and was described as a revelation in print media. It was quite different from what was already out there with the Irish Independent, the Examiner, and other newspapers of the time. When it was launched in September of 1931, it was called a brilliant journalistic endeavour and a fine propaganda tool, which helped Fianna Fáil win the general election of 1932, going into a coalition with Labour, and then swaying undecided voters in the 1933 general election, where De Valera got an overall majority. And it was with this overall majority that he saw the green light to dismantle the aspects of the 1921 treaty, which Fianna Fáil and the anti-treaty Republicans had issues with. The very first Victor Brown cartoon, which appeared on that very first edition of the Irish Press on the 5th of September 1931, was the following. It's a French Revolution scene where the Irish Press has a list of people that it's going to send to the guillotine, and it's going to overthrow the old order. This is really significant. It's one of my favorite cartoons. It's really significant because at the time, there was a certain amount of distrust and suspicion about Fianna Fáil and whether or not they were wedded to the democratic process. They had links with the IRA, and there were also slurs thrown at them from their political opponents about communism. Of course, that wasn't true, but it just highlights the level of distrust that was going on. Of course, Fianna Fáil didn't help themselves because in 1928, a now infamous phrase uttered by Sean Lemass, who was the future leader of the party, said that Fianna Fáil were a slightly constitutional party. So it was against this backdrop that the Irish Press comes on the scene, showing this French Revolution cartoon threatening to overthrow the old order. And this is when their first sort of comparison with what was going on in Brexit. This cartoon that we're looking at right now is from the Daily Mirror in 2016 and is in relation to Brexit. All you see, the main players around the Brexit, you've got Jeremy Corbyn, you've got Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, Nicola Sturgeon's there, and the executioner is Nigel Farage. And this very much signifies, an end of an older order, sort of political order in Britain. So there are comparisons there to be drawn. And just a little bit on the editor of the Irish Press, who's a very important figure, and that is Frank Gallaher. And Frank Gallaher was well known for his being a master of what was called Republican propaganda during the Irish Revolutionary period, and then in the 1920s, editing various newspapers and magazines, including Untitled. So he was known as a master propagandist, and what you see with Victor Brown's cartoons comes from Frank Gallaher. There's no doubt about that. This is the front cover of the very first edition of the Irish Press, and it's very noticeable for a number of reasons. In the front, in the middle, you have a picture. It's probably a bit fuzzy here, but it is of the mother of Patrick and Willie Pearse, two of the leaders of the 1916 Rising, two of the executed leaders. She ceremoniously switching on the printing press. Below it, you have an article from Douglas Hyde, who was the future president of Ireland. He was a former president of the Gaelic League. And what he's doing in this article is imploring people in the state to speak Irish. On the right-hand side, you see an article talking about the benefits of tariffs. So it's essentially what is happening with Fianna Fáil at that moment. They're claiming ownership of the revolutionary past in 1916. They're also promoting a cultural nationalist agenda, but also looking at how protectionism is going to feature politically. And we can see this in a letter which Frank Gallaher, the editor, sent to the British United Press, informing what stories the Irish press would be interested in. There's lots going on there in relation to Catholicism and Catholic parties in other countries. But crucially, what you see here is they wanted all reference to tariffs, both industrial and agricultural, with particular reference to new tariffs. So what you're seeing here is the Irish press trying to normalize this idea of protectionism and a new way of conducting their economic business. Victor Brown, who I mentioned is the artist behind these cartoons. Unfortunately, we don't have a photograph of him. Victor Brown was born in 1900. He was an Englishman. He was born in Nuneaton in Warwickshire, but spent part of his early life in Ireland. His father was in the British Army, stationed in Ireland. He went back to Ireland and then returned around the age of 20 to study art, and was close friends with a lot of the prominent artists of the day, including Jack B. Yeats. Now, the content of the Irish press cartoons is quite Republican, as I've mentioned, but for Brown, it has to be said that this was merely another job for him. He received a lot of different commissions around this period, including in November of 1934, he was designed the wedding cake for Prince George, the Duke of Kent. So it was essentially just a job for him, but he was very important at visualizing Fianna Fáil's policies in the 1930s. Now, one of the first things we hear or heard in relation to Brexit back in 2016 was the divorce bill. And this is a term now that's entered into our everyday lives, this divorce bill. What was the divorce bill? Well, this is what Britain's obligations to the EU budget were. And there were a lot of questions around this, such as how much was that going to be? How was it calculated? And crucially, was it ever going to be paid? Because there were, sticking points and wrangling points around this. And of course, as we've seen in relation to the Irish case, there was a substantial sum of money there, and what could be viewed as the divorce bill of 1921, which came back into central politics in 1932. The divorce bill, as I mentioned, the 1921 divorce bill, of course, I'm talking about, is in relation to the land annuities, but included in all that were civil servants' pensions under the British regime and the Royal Irish Constabulary pensions. Here we see one of Victor Brown's cartoons addressing that divorce bill. You see John Bull, who represents Britain, sitting, just finished a large meal and is refusing to pay. Ireland, as the waiter, has the bill, and John Bull saying, "You expect me to pay for that after I've eaten?" So they're having a bit of fun with a serious issue here. Of course, in both cases, there was a serious amount of wrangling going on in relation to whether the bill was going to be paid or not, or how much each country had contributed to, their particular union, their budget. So we see in as early as 1979, Britain joins in the mid 70s. But as early as 1979, Margaret Thatcher was saying about Britain contributed too much to the EU budget. And that's a theme that ran right through, right up until the recent present time. But we see here in this cartoon, which is not one of Victor Brown's, it is a reproduction of an older cartoon from around the turn of the century from the Freeman's Journal. And it is in relation to the 1894 Financial Relations Commission by Hugh Childers, which claimed that Britain had overtaxed Ireland to the tune of 2 to 3 million per capita over the last number of decades of the 19th century. So you see there's a long-standing aggravation here, a long-standing sticking point about how much each country had to pay into the particular budget. And this became a real central point on the campaign trail in 1932. A number of days before the 1932 general election, Sean Lemass was in Donegal campaigning on this and highlighting the moral and legal, case for withholding these land annuities. Around the same time as this is going on, you have the Lysine Conference in 1932. And this conference was about reparations of war debts. The Allies had spent a lot during World War I, and now had owed the United States a lot of money. So at this conference, Britain and a few of the other allies were agitating or campaigning for a suspension of these payments. And of course, given that Britain was asking Ireland to keep paying up, the Irish press seized on this, and what was the hypocrisy of Britain asking Ireland to pay its debts while it tried to get out of substantially more larger debts. You see Ramsay MacDonald here making the case for suspension of the debts here. And there were a number of cartoons like that in the Irish press over those months of 1932, including these, the couple here in front of me. You have John Bull representing Britain, of course, kneeling down in front of Uncle Sam saying, "Forgive us our debts," but he's kneeling on the back of Ireland. You've also got James Henry Thomas, J.H. Thomas, who was the Secretary of State for Dominion Affairs in the UK government, choking an Irishman inside the doorway of Downing Street, saying, "I'll make you Irish pay," while Ramsay MacDonald is hiding behind the door of number 10, afraid that America might hear. So what you have here is Ireland, and particularly the Irish press, believing that they have a moral right, as I pointed out, that Britain are trying to get out of paying their debts. But what is also interesting here is that Ireland is highlighting that they have this powerful ally in the United States, when that wasn't necessarily the case at that point. A further one here, you have J.H. Thomas again. He's always dressed in a top hat and tails. He was known in real life as being a very dapper gentleman, but he's tying himself in knots here, trying to explain why it's okay for Britain to get out of its debts, while Ireland can't get out of its divorce bill debts. Brown wasn't the only cartoonist or publication which picked up on this idea. You've got Gordon Brewster here in the Evening Herald, John Bull, at Christmas time, this was in December 1932, playing a Christmas tune called "The Suspension of the War Debts" outside the USA's door. So it was a widely, held belief that Britain was trying to be hypocritical here. One of the more historically loaded terms that you find that was used during Brexit was the idea of Britain being in shackles to the EU. Suella Fernandez, who's a Tory MP and the chair of the European Research Group, said in November of 2016, Britain must untie itself from the EU shackles by using Brexit to leave the customs union. Of course, there can be no doubt that the term shackles denotes some type of slavery. And it's a really highly emotive and historically charged term, given, the history of slavery in the West. And its term, it's meant to infer that one side of a political relationship is one of servitude or some sort of slavery. And you can see that in this cartoon from the Telegraph of the lion and the unicorn, two of Britain's really prominent symbols, breaking free of the shackles of the EU. Now, this was used to excess by the Irish press in the 1930s. And this particular cartoon we see here of a figure representing an Irishman in shackles in his arms and his legs and coming through bars, which have the words on them: crushed trade, blockade, British duties, and ranches, which were the large industrial ranches which were producing cattle for the British market. Now, off in the distance, you see an idealized small farm, which was a very important symbol of Irishness for, cultural nationalism and Fianna Fáil in those days. The caption is, "We will come out of this a real nation." And this was a caption, this was part of De Valera's speech at the 1932 Fianna Fáil Ardèche. And the idea that Britain is preventing Ireland becoming a real nation. And you see in the distance, as I say, the farm. Now, there's also a bit of rural nostalgia here that the Irish press is tapping into. And of course, Brexit was, partly fueled by nostalgia as well. You have Michel Barnier, in the European Union negotiator, in May of 2019, saying Brexit was partly caused by a nostalgia for the past that served no political purpose in the present day. So there are elements of a nostalgia for the past in these cartoons as well. There's another cartoon here called The Present Financial System, and this came in a matter of weeks into the Irish Press's run in September of 1931. What you have here are, a family all dressed in rags behind the barriers of the present financial system. You see in the background you have plenty there, and the poor Irish peasant as a cartoon trope, as it were, has a long history. You have that in relation to the famine in the mid 19th century. You also have it in the land war of the later 19th century, and the figure of an Irish man or an Irish woman in rags. It's a very important depiction, and the Irish press were masterful at this. They were trading on what was viewed as centuries of oppression and bringing it forward into the economic fight of the day. Another cartoon by Brown in this period in 1933, not directly related to the economic war, but it was essentially part of an overall campaign by De Valera to put some distance between Ireland and Britain. This one is in relation to the Oath of Allegiance, which was another aspect of the 1921 treaty that anti-treaty people weren't in favour of. So it was an oath of allegiance to the British King. In 1933, once De Valera gets his overall majority, he goes after that and takes it out of the Constitution. So this reflects that aspect of dismantling of the treaty. You have the figure of Ireland, again with the shackles, with the Irish people behind them, and the caption, "The Irish have stood upon their feet." And that was from Archbishop Mannix, the Archbishop of Melbourne, who was born in Ireland. So what you see here is a lot of different elements of the 1930s, the economic war, the dismantle of aspects of the treaty, which all contribute to, a campaign of separatism. Returning to the present day, and you see with this Paul Thomas cartoon of the Daily Mail, you see Boris Johnson, and it's related to the withdrawal bill. He's standing on a ripped up European Union flag, but he's literally shaking the chains free. So it's a very powerful symbol that's used in a lot of different cartoons. Now, once you get free of these shackles, where is it that you go? You go to the sunny uplands, or the sunlit uplands, depending on who's saying it. So this is another phrase which has become more and more well known in the last number of years. In October of 2019, the Tory politician and chief Brexiteer, Jacob Rees-Mogg, talked about the broad sunlit uplands that await us. Now, of course, this is mentioned in the Houses of Commons before, particularly in relation to Winston Churchill's very famous "This was their finest hour" speech on the 18th of June, 1940. And Churchill talking about, if we stand up to Hitler, all Europe may be free and the life in the world may move forward into broad sunlit uplands. Now, of course, Brexit, leaving the European Union, and the supposed stance of Britain alone in World War II are connected and form a lot of the discourse around this period. But I leave that to the World War II historians to look at that. Of course, one of the Northern Ireland politician also talked about the sunny uplands famously in a 2019 rally, Brexit rally in London. But 8 years before Churchill talked about the sunlit uplands in Europe, and decades before Brexit was a thing, De Valera, Fianna Fáil and the Irish Press were talking about their own sunlit uplands. This particular cartoon here from March of 1932 shows 10 years in the nation's life. And they talk about civil war, executions, all these hills to get over, the oath and an imposed constitution, coercion, where finally you get to the last figure who's literally on the sunlit uplands. So it is something which is being sold to Irish readers and Irish citizens in this case, and later Brexit in the case of Britain. the promise of an Irish Eldorado here and a British Eldorado in 2016, 2017, not the soap opera for those who can remember it. But it's this dream of a land of plenty and sunshine, which never really translates into reality, as we know. But it is an important political rallying cry that we see in the 1930s in Ireland and the 2010s in Britain. Now, one of the first sort of ties with the Irish past anyway was in relation to the following. And it was perhaps the utterance or the story that sort of began for me to connect all these dots together. And that was, of course, Tory MP Priti Patel apparently saying that the Irish should be starved out so the EU can drop the backstop. And the backstop was one of course, the sticking points of the many sticking points of the whole Brexit era. And Priti Patel is supposedly suggested the possibility of food shortages in Ireland in the event of a no deal Brexit to get the EU to drop the backstop. A government report was leaked to the Times, which indicated that there could be food shortages in Ireland and that the economic impact on Ireland would be greater than that of Britain in the event of a no deal Brexit. Patel was supposedly said that, the government was well aware of this and should have pressed home this idea during Brexit negotiations. Given the historically, historical and emotional, sort of idea of the Irish famine, even 170 years on, the reaction was swift and it came from all sides. One of our own politicians here, Naomi Long, in reacting to it, said that talked about the profound ignorance and insensitivity of our history from Priti Patel, and she said that was truly grim. In Dublin, you had Richard Chambers, a journalist in Dublin, saying that someone will need to look out the history books over in Whitehall. But in Britain itself, you had a number of high-profile people criticising as well, including BBC journalist John Simpson, who said if she really did suggest the use of food shortages to force Ireland to change its approach to Brexit, he was more shocked than he could say, and asked, have we learned nothing since the 1840s? While prominent Labour MP David Lammy talked about the starvation of innocent Irish men, women and children was one of the most shameful episodes in British colonial history. So there was a lot of criticism to Patel, who denied that she'd actually said that. This is something that Ireland actually used during the 1930s in their own economic war with Britain. And I'll just draw your attention to a couple of these cartoons now. Back to the Lysine Conference, and I really do hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. In 1932, you have Ramsay MacDonald addressing the leaders of the world and mistakenly reading out a letter he had written to the Irish Free State, and it says, hand over every penny or I'll starve you out. Oh, excuse me, that is a letter to the Free State. And it's really interesting that you see, supposed allies of Ireland at this time, the USA and Germany, with mouths open in shock. Italy's losing the monocle here, in that classic, unbelieving face that you see in old movies. And Belgium is biting the fingernails. So it's really interesting that this article, or this cartoon rather, gives this impression that the leaders of the country are in tune with Ireland's needs, and that Ireland has allies in the major powers apart from Britain in the world. And of course, that isn't necessarily the case, but it's a powerful piece of propaganda. In August of 1932, and this is another of my favorite of Brown's cartoons, you have John Bull again standing on a chimney stack. Behind him are cobwebs, which represent the decline in British industry at the time, the supposed decline in British industry. And he's looking over what is the Free State tariff wall. And he's saying, I can never understand those Irish. The more I try to starve them out, the fatter they become. Now, at this time, the beginning of August, you get a lot of newspapers talking about the famine. The Irish Independent, a couple of days before the publication of this cartoon, were talking about how this crisis, with the ports at a standstill, with no food being moved, that it was the worst crisis since the famine, and there was a real fear that famine conditions could return. While in this same edition of the Irish Press on the 5th of August 1932, you had an article which spoke about the famine as well. But interestingly, the Irish Press talked about the famine clearances brought all of Ireland together in common cause. So they're essentially using the famine, or the memory of the famine, as a rallying point, saying that we faced adversity in the 1840s. We're facing it now again in the 1930s. With those cartoons, you see that it's very much pitting Ireland against England. England is the external enemy, just in the way that in the EU, the many countries of the EU were the enemies of England for a time there, and still ongoing to a certain degree. But in both cases, what's interesting is there is also an internal enemy, and that internal enemy needs addressed and pressure put on it. And so, of course, talking about this selection of newspapers that you see here in front of you, one in particular, which from the Daily Mail on the 4th of November 2016, had the now infamous headline, "The Enemies of the People." And this was in reaction to the High Court of England and Wales made the judgment that the government had to get the consent of Parliament to trigger Article 50. Of course, the British press were so vital in pushing the Brexit agenda. They were apoplectic when anyone seemed to try to stifle it. And now that this is a really infamous headline, "The Enemies of the People," but if we look back in the 1930s, you can see similar language being used. And take this example of the Irish Press from the 9th of November 1931. And the quote begins with, "We elected a government definitely to carry out the policy of protection for native industries, but it is cast as mandate to the wind at the bidding of the enemies of the people." So identical language being used. And another example is from a couple of years later, in April 1933, a letter supposedly from a Free State farmer. And it reads, "Sometimes it almost seems as if there was an organized campaign by covert enemies of the people to destroy our credit by picturing our approaching bankruptcy. For there is at times unity of expression amongst the pessimists that suggests a common origin." So I don't know if paranoia is the right term, but there's definitely a siege mentality going on here. And it's us against the world, as it was with the press in Britain. And the enemy of the people is, of course, Cumann na Gael in this. And Cumann na Gael, when they're represented in Irish press cartoons, it's always the leader of the party, W.T. Cosgrave. And you can see from this January 1933 cartoon, Cosgrave is always portrayed as a small man, very slight, with foppish hair or a bowler hat on. Anyways, dress suggests that he's not a real Irishman. And people like Felix Larkin have examined this particular representation of what Britishness in Irish newspapers, cartoons. So this particular cartoon, you have John Bull and W.T. Cosgrave shaking hands together. And the caption is, both of them saying at the same time, "I look to you to win this election for me." So it's unambiguous. It's portraying Cosgrave and Cumann na Gael as the enemies of the people and in the pocket of Britain and big British economic interests. Another one here, if we're going back to the divorce bill, you see Cosgrave running to London with the 5 million in a bag over his shoulder. Now, there's another phrase I think that everybody had heard lots of times, just as the negotiations were about to get underway between Britain and the EU, and that was, "They need us more than we need them." Now, this was repeated ad nauseum from Brexiteers right throughout the Tory party, from UKIP, from Vote Leave. John Moynihan of Vote Leave talked about it in 2016. But this particular tweet here represents it from Nigel Farage in June of 2017. Actually says, "They need us more than we need them. European politicians must listen to their own workers." Now, I don't think that an article from the Express would cut much ice with the political elite of Europe. But it raises questions about who is this intended for. Is it intended for a domestic audience to sort of keep the troops rallied, keep them galvanized, and keep them on board with this separation project? And we see this in the 1930s as well. And we look at a number of cartoons here, including this one from July of 1933, again of John Bull. But he's surrounded by people who are now out of work in Britain, supposedly now out of work in Britain, in rags, showing that Ireland is thriving while Britain is on the downturn. Of course, that's not the case. When it's not John Bull that they're satirizing, of course, the person that they do focus on is someone we've already been introduced to, and that is J.H. Thomas, the Minister for Dominion Affairs. Here you have Thomas, J.H. Thomas, in October of 1932, sitting at home in his armchair, wondering how he can hurt the Irish economy even more and saying another 10% on Anglo-Irish trade should do it. But it's notable for the background drop. You have a lot of ghost-like gaunt figures with flat caps on, walking past in file. And I think this represents what were known as the hunger marches, which were taking place in Britain around this time, and showing how, you know, the British policies, if they were enacted, would damage Britain more than they would Ireland. And another one called Mr. Thomas's Big Stick. You can see him trying to swing at Ireland, but hitting British trade interests, you know, instead, while Ireland stands there tall and straight and proud. Yet another phrase that we heard at this time, around this time, 2017 time, was that there would be countries queuing up for post-Brexit trade deals. Boris Johnson made this claim in Politico in January of 2017. Now, the reality of this is, of course, much different. And I will go on to explain some of similar themes in Ireland in the 1930s. But of course, this is a very, you know, it's an important thing to keep the troops rallied again. But in reality, sorry, it is much more complicated. And there wasn't a lot of evidence at the time that these free trade agreements would compensate from the blow of leaving the European single market and customs union. And the Institute of Fiscal Studies said that this was simple arithmetic and a basic understanding of trade, which, you know, includes me. That's about as far as I go. That gains from free trade agreements was likely to be small. So, of course, Donald Trump wanted a big and exciting trade deal done really quickly. He's not there anymore. But other major economies, such as China and Japan, were kind of lukewarm on the idea of doing a trade deal with Britain outside of the EU. And this kind of soundbite of positivity translates into Victor Brown's editorial cartoons, what we look at now. And again, does this, you know, cut any ice outside of Ireland or outside of Britain in these times? Or was it mainly, you know, to keep people on board with the separatist project? So there are a couple of cartoons here in relation to Ireland doing trade deals around the world when they were engaged in negotiations with Britain. In the first one here, you see Britain and Ireland with a trade barrier around it, but you've got a number of countries represented by boats breaking through the trade barrier, such as the United States, France, Germany, and Poland. While in this other one, you have J.H. Thomas again with the top hat, looking very dapper. You've got you know, and this is significant, a youthful Ireland with the 5 million in hand, towing boats named Germany, France, and Italy behind them, given the idea that they're already in negotiations and striking trade deals with these countries. There's been a number of, you know, piece of research, books, any amount of them written on the trade war. One in particular is of interest here, and it's by Mervyn O'Driscoll, and he looked at trade negotiations between Ireland and Britain, or Ireland and Germany at this time when the economic war was going on, and I will go back to that. But of course, the United States is here, and this is something we've looked at earlier. Ireland viewed the United States as an ally, given, you know, the decades of emigration to the United States by people from Ireland. Now, what is interesting here also is that De Valera was born in Ireland, and the money to raise the funds for the Irish Press came from Irish America. So the idea of doing a trade deal with the United States would, of course, benefit economically, but it'd also be very symbolically important. However, looking, researching this, I found a letter from the United States from Michael McWhite, who is Ireland's representative in the United States, to Dublin in August of 1934, which brought, frankly, disappointing news. And remember, 1934 is 2 years after this particular cartoon was published. McWhite says that he spoke to the acting Secretary of State in America and sounded him out the feasibility of beginning negotiations for a trade agreement between the Irish Free State and the United States. They said that they were currently engaged in negotiations with a number of countries, including half a dozen Latin American countries. So there was just no way that this was going to happen. And he ends on a really pessimistic note saying, America has practically nothing to gain in any free trade agreement that could be reached with the Irish Free State. The Irish state did, however, strike a trade deal a couple of years before with Canada at the Dominions Conference, the Ottawa Conference in 1932. And that was all dominions within the British Empire came to discuss how to best mitigate the effects of the Great Depression. Now, while there was an agreement struck between Canada and Ireland, the Irish press basically dismissed this. As you can see here, they portrayed the Ottawa Conference as a shouting and fighting match of no value. But going back to trade deals around the world again, this is another favorite of mine, a cartoon. This was in 1932, the boomerang thrower it's called. You see John Bull again, throwing the special duties bill, but it coming back and hitting him in the head. While Ireland seems that industry is thriving, agriculture is thriving, and everything's rosy. And in the background, you have German coal coming in. And Germany was a country which Ireland negotiated with while this was going on. And Mervyn O'Driscoll shows that it was cantankerous. It wasn't straightforward at all. And Ireland actually withdrew from the negotiations at one point. The thing that brought Germany back to the negotiating table was the Coal and Cattle Pact of January 1935 between Ireland and Britain, which mitigated some of the harsh conditions of the economic war of the 1930s. That actually brought Germany to the negotiating table with Ireland. But rather than go down that rabbit hole where discuss the German trade deal with Ireland, what I want to highlight is that these pithy phrases that you hear from Boris Johnson and other people, plus the propaganda that you're getting in the Irish Press newspaper and other newspapers, British newspapers of the present day, really just show that any trade deal, any negotiations is going to be very difficult and not as easy as these supposed oven-ready deals, or to use modern terminology, make out to be. Another sort of negative consequence of Brexit, which many people have experienced and have commented upon, is this, the nativist element of it. Of course, one of the mantras of the UK government after leaving, starting to negotiate to leave the EU, was that of global Britain, to show that Britain would be a trader with all nations, that would be very open. But however, despite these global ambitions, Brexit unleashed a nativism which focused on British identity and supposedly put British people first. And you can see an example here from the then Brexit Secretary, David Davis, talking about British jobs should be offered to British workers first. So this is reminiscent of Buy Irish campaigns in the 1930s, but Britain also had their own Buy British campaigns in the 1930s too, and it has to be seen in the context of the Great Depression. In 1931 and 1932, you have a couple of cartoons here by Victor Brown, which show figuratively and literally foreign goods and foreign-made goods crushing the Irish person and the unemployed. So this is very much depicting what should be done in terms of Irish jobs for Irish people, very much like what you were seeing during and after Brexit. An interesting picture here from the 1930s, and you see Maud Gonne McBride protesting on O'Connell Bridge in Dublin, boycotting British goods. So this is part of a really, grassroots and government campaign to buy Irish. In the late 1980s, you had the historian and senator in the Irish Senate, John A. Murphy, give a really interesting rundown of by Irish campaigns throughout history. But in relation to the 1930s, he talked about the last heyday of protectionism in the 1930s. We had a Buy Irish campaign, and he said that the spirit which existed itself was fairly narrow, in fairly narrow protectionist terms. During that period, he said De Valera had no intention of extending any special concessions to his separated brethren in Northern Ireland. For him, the interests of protected industries were solely in the 26 counties. And the reason why I include that is because we all know here that the border was one and remains one of the most contentious parts of this new dispensation and the withdrawal from the EU. So you would think that would be reflected in the cartoons of the 1930s. However, there's just one real cartoon that focuses on the border in the 1930s, and that is this one. And you've got, the ghost of Abraham Lincoln. People ask why Abraham Lincoln, but De Valera, he was one of De Valera's political heroes. And you've got Abraham Lincoln, standing in the west of Ireland, telling people, take that barrier away or it'll destroy you both. That was the only reference you really got in relation to the cartoons of Victor Brown in relation to the trade war and the border. But back to Buy British, you had Boris Johnson when he was campaigning to be the Conservative Party Prime Minister, the Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister, that he would roll back the influences of the state and promote a Buy British campaign. And of course, that meant jettison EU rules which governed England. Nice comparison here is, of the same time, the early 1930s, you've got a Buy Irish poster from Victor Brown. You've also got a Buy British poster here, and it's all about promoting employment within each country. David Thackeray of the University of Essex has looked at these examples in the 1930s, and he talks about, in the current sort of Brexit era, Brexit, what was essentially a debate about the global economy, plays out in the British media largely as one of national politics. And that is, again, reflected in the Irish press and other newspapers of that period in Ireland. Just to finish that section, we have a New Year's Eve 1932 cartoon by Victor Brown of a youthful Irish Ireland in 1933. And behind it, you see a lot of the older men, commenting upon how sturdy this youth is. And this youthful campaign, as it was portrayed, was hugely important to, signal a new departure. One of the last sticking points of the many sticking points that was Brexit was about fishing rights. And that, went right up to the deadline in the end of 2020. This cartoon by Bob Morgan of The Telegraph shows the French trawler with the EU flag filling his nets full of British fish, what were called British fish, and pointing at Britain, calling the British fisherman a thief. Now this taps into, what is a long, campaigns against the common fisheries policy from organizations such as Save Britain's Fish in the early to mid 1990s. You have the Fishermen's Association Limited over the 1990s and 2000s. And later you have Fishing for Leave from 2016 onwards. And as I say, this remained a sticking point right up to the end, but it was also a point of contention in the 1930s, although it was not directly connected to the economic trade war with Britain. You look at this particular cartoon from 1933, and you've got a foreign trawler ploughing through an Irish boat and saying, give him a £10 note for his troubles. But the caption is, surely it's time to end this. And this was, in the context of protectionism, which was taking root in Ireland and protecting their industries, native industries, protecting their borders, etc. Ireland did enact Sea Fisheries Protection Act in 1933, which Fianna Fáil Minister for Agriculture said in one of the debates around this, what this Act of Parliament brought in was to prevent foreign fishing vessels from not only fishing in these reserved waters, but also from hovering there. So it's very much, you see, this nativist policy going on. And it's reflected in the language in newspapers at the time. So this first, example is from the Southern Star Irish newspaper in 1935, where it talks about the challenges of that particular act, and you see here that fishing vessels from outside of Irish waters are called foreign invaders, and it's bordering on very nasty language. Whereas in 2018, you look at the Yorkshire Post was talking about, to see a gunboat keeping foreign fishermen at bay after Brexit, setting sail to protect our fishing waters from foreign intruders. So you see the similar language being involved around both sets of circumstances in the 1930s, foreign invaders, and in 2018, foreign intruders. So it's, you're seeing nasty language coming to the fore here. In 1937, the Connacht Tribune reported Mirchu, which I hope I'm pronouncing right, which is the Irish patrol boat, firing on French trawlers and cheering lines of Irish fishermen on the shore. And of course, this is the stuff of Brexiteer dreams and featured very prominently in newspapers in just last December in 2020. You had the Daily Mail and the Sun advocating for the British Navy to go out and fire on foreign trawlers to protect British fishing waters. So there's a similar theme going on there as well. But, things come to a conclusion, not necessarily, as we well know, a satisfactory conclusion for all concerned. But in 1938, with the World War II on the horizon, a deal was struck. And John Gibney has looked at this recently and compared the 1930s with the present day. He hasn't looked at any cartoons as I have done, thank goodness. But he tells of the discussions to end the trade war. He says Ireland was to pay a 10 million lump sum as a final settlement. So there you go. You've got another divorce bill there. But he argues that, to use the parlance of our times, it wasn't a bad deal for Ireland. And of course, you see Theresa May and other people saying they'd rather have no deal than a bad deal. But anyway, this is the deal that Ireland got. And this was seized upon by one of the other cartoonists that I talked about earlier, Charles E. Kelly in the Dublin Opinion. He portrays De Valera, as many cartoonists did, as this overly tall, stern figure. But there he is outside the House of Commons in 1938 negotiating the trade deal. And there's a gentleman coming up selling him a poster. There you go, Governor. Anyway, that's besides my impression of a Cockney. So that was the deal that was struck in 1938. But also you've got all these elements of trust. And in recent weeks, there's a lot of people talking about an erosion of trust, a complete erosion of trust in the post-Brexit deal era. This was something which the Irish press seized upon as well. And you have J.H. Thomas again with stabbing Irish trade in the back. And the caption from Thomas is, "I deplore more than I can say that I was compelled to take the course I did." So, things are never over. And the Irish press highlighted this. But as we can see, the two sets of scenarios aren't identical, but there are interesting parallels to be had. And hopefully you've been able to see that the Irish press were promoting ideas which were relevant to us over the last number of years. But the questions remain, were they just simply to reassure Irish people in the 1930s case and British people in the 2010s and going into the 2020s? So hopefully you've been able to see some parallels that you've been able to draw out there and see how effective propaganda can be in relation to trade disputes. So thank you very much.